I didn't think anything of it when I first signed the lease. The apartment was cheap, and cheap was all I cared about. It was in an older building on the outskirts of town, tall and narrow with dark brick walls and windows that always looked a little dirty no matter how much I cleaned them. The landlord was an odd man, thin, nervous, always tugging at his collar like he was uncomfortable in his own skin. When he handed me the keys, he said something strange. "You'll be fine as long as you don't go looking for trouble." I laughed it off, not thinking much of it. I should have paid more attention. The apartment itself was small but livable. One bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a small living room. The walls were pale yellow, and the floors creaked with every step. I spent the first week unpacking, cleaning, and trying to make the place feel like home. It wasn't until my second week there that I noticed something strange. There was a door. I hadn't seen it before, not once while I'd moved in, cleaned, or unpacked. It was in the hallway, just past the bathroom, slightly recessed into the wall. The paint on it was darker than the rest of the apartment, and the handle looked ancient, made of tarnished brass. It didn't belong. I tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked, and no key I had fit. I figured it was just a utility closet sealed shut years ago and ignored it, but that door would not let me forget it. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was coming from the street, soft thuds, like someone knocking. I turned over, burying my face in the pillow, but the sound got louder. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the hallway. I sat up in bed, my chest tightening. The knocking was steady and deliberate, echoing faintly through the apartment. I crept out of bed, every nerve in my body screaming for me to stop, but I kept walking. When I reached the hallway, the knocking stopped. The air felt colder near the door. I pressed my hand against it. It was freezing. I tried the handle again, still locked. That night I barely slept. The next day I asked the landlord about it. "Do you know what's behind that door?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The landlord went pale. He tugged at his collar and avoided my eyes. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said quickly. "But it's locked." "It's sealed for a reason," he snapped. "Don't mess with it." He hurried off before I could ask any more questions. His reaction only made me more curious. That night, the knocking returned. Knock, knock, knock. I stayed in bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child, trying to block it out. But then I heard something worse. A whisper. It started soft, so faint I almost didn't hear it. "Let me out!" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I held my breath, listening. "Please, let me out." It was coming from behind the door. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning I went to the hardware store and bought a crowbar. I didn't care what the landlord had said. I needed to know what was behind that door. That night I stood in the hallway, crowbar in hand. The knocking had started again, louder this time, as though something was pounding against the wood. Knock, knock, knock. I jammed the crowbar into the seam of the door and pushed with everything I had. The wood groaned as the frame splintered. With one final shove, the lock snapped and the door creaked open. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, and it smelled like earth and rot. I aimed my flashlight into the darkness beyond. There was a staircase. It led down. I hesitated, but the knocking had stopped, and the silence felt worse. I stepped through the doorway, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet, and descended the stairs. The air grew colder the farther I went. The walls were stone now, rough and uneven, as though they'd been carved by hand. At the bottom of the stairs was a narrow hallway lined with old rusted doors. Each one had a small slot at the top, like prison doors. I walked slowly, my flashlight flickering in the dark. The hallway stretched farther than it should have, longer than the entire apartment building above it. I felt like I was walking through something ancient, something forgotten. And then I heard it. A voice. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hands. There was no one there. But the voice had come from one of the doors. I walked toward the nearest one. The slot at the top was covered with a small metal flap. Slowly, I pushed it open and shone my light inside. The room was empty, just stone walls and a dirt floor. Then I heard breathing. I turned the light toward the corner. A figure was crouched there, its back to me. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched too tightly over its bones. Its head turned slowly, unnaturally, and I saw its face. It had no eyes, just empty sockets. And it was smiling. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beams spun wildly, illuminating glimpses of other figures in the cells, twitching, shifting, crawling toward the doors. "Let us out." The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls, filling my head. I ran. I don't know how I made it back upstairs, but I slammed the basement door shut behind me and pushed a bookshelf in front of it. The knocking started immediately, furious and relentless. Bang, bang, bang. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment. The next morning I returned with the landlord. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but he just shook his head, his face pale and drawn. "I told you not to mess with it," he whispered. When we entered the apartment, the hallway was silent. The door was gone. The section of the wall where it had been was smooth, as though there'd never been a door there at all. I moved out that same day. I still hear the whispers sometimes, especially at night. And once, when I was driving past that building, I swear I saw a figure standing in the hallway window, watching me, smiling. I moved into the old college rental house about a month ago. The place was cheap, dirt cheap, too good to pass up, really, considering my shrinking bank account and the fact that all the nicer apartments near campus were already taken. It was a 3-bedroom house, supposedly built in the late 1800s, with walls that seemed to breathe cold air, floorboards that creaked like whispered warnings, and windows that let in far too little light for comfort. My roommates, Sarah and James, were decent enough. Sarah was an arts major, the type who could paint something beautiful in 3 strokes and survive on instant noodles for weeks. James was quiet, spent most of his time locked in his room studying biology. The house itself was the problem. The first thing I noticed was the window. It was in the hallway, just above the staircase leading to the 2nd floor. It sat about shoulder height, tucked between 2 framed paintings of old landscapes. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it, just a small square window with dusty glass and a wood frame painted white. But the view outside didn't make sense. Every other window in the house showed normal things, the front yard, the driveway, the broken fence at the back. But this window showed nothing. It was just a wall of black. It didn't matter if it was day or night. The glass was always dark, as though there was something solid pressed against it. When I asked Sarah and James about it, neither of them cared. "It's probably painted over or something," James said with a shrug. Sarah barely looked up from her sketchbook. Old houses are weird. I wanted to believe them. But the more I looked at that window, the more I was sure it was looking back at me. About a week later, the sound started. I was home alone one evening while Sarah and James were out. I was halfway through a movie when I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from upstairs. At first I thought it was Sarah, but when I called out, no one answered. The footsteps stopped. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the stairs, my heart pounding with every creak of the wood. The hallway was empty. All the bedroom doors were shut, and there was no sign of anyone there. But as I turned to head back down, I noticed something. The window. It was fogged up like someone had been standing right next to it, breathing against the glass. There was even a faint smudge, something like a handprint, but too distorted to be real. I wiped the glass with my sleeve. The smudge vanished, but the window stayed black. Over the next few days, the window became harder to ignore. I'd find myself stopping in the hallway, staring at it without realizing how much time had passed. I started feeling uneasy, like something about the house had changed. I wasn't the only one. Sarah started complaining about nightmares. She'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, but she could never remember what she'd dreamed about. James grew even quieter than usual, snapping at both of us over nothing. I caught him once, late at night, standing in the hallway and staring at the window. "James," I said softly. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed locked on the black glass. "There's something in there." His voice was barely a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. I didn't sleep much that night. The window got worse. One afternoon, I was coming up the stairs when I noticed the blackness behind the glass wasn't solid anymore. It seemed to be moving. I stopped and stared, my breath caught in my throat. The darkness rippled slightly as though something was shifting just beyond the glass. And then it stopped. And I saw it. For a split second, a pair of pale hands pressed against the window from the other side. I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the stairs. When I looked again, the glass was empty, just black. I told Sarah and James what I'd seen, but they both brushed me off. "You're imagining things," Sarah said, though her voice trembled. James didn't say anything. He just avoided looking at the window altogether. That night, I woke up to a noise. It was soft at first, like faint tapping coming from downstairs. Tap, tap, tap. I checked the time, 2:37 a.m. I didn't want to go down there, but the noise wouldn't stop. Reluctantly, I grabbed my phone for light and crept out of my room. The house was dark, the air freezing against my skin. I tiptoed toward the staircase. That's when I saw it. Someone was standing in the hallway at the bottom of the stairs. The figure was tall and still, barely more than a silhouette in the dark. I held my phone up, my hands trembling as I shone the light toward it. And the figure moved. It turned and walked into the shadows. I don't remember running back to my room, but I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I sat on my bed, breathing hard, my back against the wall. I could hear something moving outside my door, slow, dragging footsteps like someone pacing the hallway. Then I heard it. A soft tap, coming from the window in the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. I buried my head in my arms, squeezing my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. The tapping grew louder, faster, more insistent, until finally, silence. The next morning, James was gone. His room was empty, his bed unmade. All his things were still there, but there was no sign of him. Sarah and I searched the house, calling his name, but we found nothing. When I passed the window, I stopped. There was something new on the glass. A faint, distorted face pressed against the inside. Sarah and I didn't stay long after that. We packed our things and left that same day, leaving James's belongings where they were. We didn't tell anyone what happened. Sometimes, though, I still dream about that house. In my dreams, I'm standing in the hallway, staring at the window, and I can see something staring back at me, waiting. I drove past the house a few weeks ago. The new tenants had moved in. As I passed by, I glanced up at the hallway window. For just a second, I saw it again. A pale hand pressing against the glass. I moved into this house 2 months ago. It's an old farmhouse, isolated at the edge of a small rural town. I wanted peace and quiet, a place to get away from the noise and chaos of city life. The house seemed perfect. It sat at the end of a dirt road surrounded by fields that stretched on for miles. There were no neighbors nearby, just empty space and the soft hum of the wind through the trees. The house itself had character. Wooden beams, creaky floorboards, and narrow windows that let in soft golden light in the mornings. It felt lived in, but not abandoned. The previous owner had left a lot of their belongings behind. Old tools in the shed, faded books on dusty shelves. But there was one thing about the house that stood out to me on the very first day: the locked basement door. It sat in the hallway next to the kitchen, heavy and wooden, with a rusted lock that looked ancient. The real estate agent told me it was just storage, and that the previous owner had misplaced the key years ago. I didn't think much of it at the time. Every old house has its quirks. I should have asked more questions. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I spent my days fixing small things around the house, patching a hole in the roof, cleaning the windows, repainting the shutters. I spent my nights reading by the fire or listening to music on my old radio. The silence out here was calming. But slowly, little things started to bother me. At night, I'd hear faint noises coming from the floorboards, like scratching or soft tapping. I told myself it was mice, maybe even squirrels in the walls. But the noises were always coming from the same direction, right above the locked basement door. One night I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't ignore. It was a steady thud, like something heavy knocking against the basement door. Thud, thud, thud. I froze in bed, straining to listen. My bedroom is on the second floor, but the sound was so clear it felt like it was right outside my door. After a few minutes it stopped. The silence was even worse. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I decided to inspect the basement door. I ran my hand along the wood, checking for cracks or openings. There were none. I tried the handle, still locked, still firm. I even knocked against it a few times, half jokingly, as if expecting someone to knock back. No response. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the base of the door there was a small gap between the wood and the floor. It was barely an inch wide, but it was there. I knelt down and peered through it. For a second I thought I saw something move, a shadow shifting in the dark. I pulled back quickly, my heart pounding. It's just my imagination, I muttered to myself. I decided to leave it alone. The next few nights the noises got louder. I'd hear faint whispering late at night, like someone was talking just below the floorboards. I couldn't make out the words, just a soft, low murmur. One night I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, like someone walking across the basement floor. Thud, thud! I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and went downstairs. The house was silent, but my skin prickled as I approached the basement door. I stood there for a long time, staring at the lock. Then I heard it. A voice. Let me out. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The voice was faint and raspy, like it had been whispering for hours. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Who or what was in there? The logical part of me tried to come up with an answer. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe there was some kind of echo in the walls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. The next day I decided to find a way into the basement. I searched the house for a spare key, checking drawers, closets, even the attic. I didn't find anything, but I did find something else. An old notebook tucked away in a box in the attic. The leather cover was cracked and the pages were yellowed with age. Inside, the handwriting was neat but frantic, as though the writer had been rushing to get the words out. The entries were short. The noises started again, the scratching, the whispering. I can't sleep. Something is in the basement. I don't know how it got there, but it won't stop calling my name. The final entry sent chills down my spine. I locked the door, but it's still trying to get out. Don't open it. That night, the whispering returned. It was louder this time, and I could hear my name, clear as day. David, David, let me out. I lay in bed, paralyzed. the blanket pulled up to my chin like a child. The voice sounded closer than before, like it was right outside my door. I didn't sleep at all. The next day I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a crowbar from the shed and stood in front of the basement door, sweating despite the cold. My hand trembled as I fit the crowbar against the lock. It took 3 hard pulls before the lock snapped and the door creaked open. A wave of cold air hit me, and I shone the flashlight into the darkness. The basement was empty. There were no shelves, no tools, no furniture, just a dirt floor and rough stone walls. The air was damp and heavy, and I could hear the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. I stepped inside, the beam of the flashlight shaking slightly. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Fresh, wet footprints leading from the far corner of the basement to where I was standing. I turned and ran. I locked the basement door behind me and shoved a chair in front of it for good measure. I didn't care if it was irrational. I wasn't going back down there. That night I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were upstairs. Slow, heavy steps moving down the hallway outside my bedroom door. They stopped right outside, and then I heard it. "David, let me in." I don't remember what happened next. I think I passed out from fear, because when I woke up it was morning and the house was silent. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and left without looking back. I haven't gone back to that house since. Sometimes, though, I still hear it, soft whispering when I'm alone at night. And once, when I checked my phone, I saw a single missed call. No number. Just silence. I moved into the hostel during my first year of university. It wasn't ideal, but it was cheap, and that was enough. The place was old, probably built in the 70s, with cracked walls and flickering lights in the hallways. But the real problem was the shared rooms. There were 6 beds crammed into mine, 3 on each side, each with just enough space to walk between. It felt like a prison cell, especially since most of the other students had already claimed their spots. I ended up with the bed in the far corner, right under the only window. At first I told myself it didn't matter. I was there to study, not to make friends. But that changed when I noticed something strange about the room. The 6th bed, the one closest to the door, was always empty. When I arrived, my roommates told me the bed wasn't being used. "There's no one assigned to it," Harris, the guy in the bed next to mine, said casually. "It's been empty since last year." "Why?" I asked. Harris shrugged. "Who knows? No one stays there long. People who do, leave." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. But the others didn't. There was something uncomfortable in the way they looked at that bed, like they were avoiding it. That night I lay awake listening to the sounds of the hostel, creaking doors, distant murmurs from other rooms. I glanced across the room at the empty bed. The sheets were rumpled as if someone had just gotten up. I told myself I was imagining it. The days passed uneventfully. Classes were long and the hostel was noisy, but every night I'd wake up to something strange. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a feeling. I'd open my eyes and for a moment everything would seem normal. The faint glow of the streetlights through the window, Harris snoring softly a few feet away. But then I'd see it. The 6th bed. The sheets would look different, like they'd been moved. Sometimes I'd swear the pillow was on the floor, or the blanket was bunched up near the edge. I'd stare at it until my vision blurred, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But one night I woke up to something worse. It was past midnight and the room was silent. I'd been dreaming, though I couldn't remember about what. My throat was dry, so I sat up to grab my water bottle. That's when I heard it, the soft sound of breathing. It wasn't Harris, he snored loudly, and this was different, shallow, close. I froze, my eyes darting across the room. My heart started pounding when I realized the sound was coming from the sixth bed. I turned my head slowly. In the darkness, I could just barely make out the shape of someone sitting up in that bed. A figure hunched over, staring straight ahead. I blinked and it was gone. The sheets were still, the bed was empty. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning I told Harris about it. He didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at me, his face serious. I told you, man, that bed's not right. What do you mean? He sighed, glancing over his shoulder like he was afraid someone would hear. There was a guy who stayed here last year. He had that bed. Quiet dude, kept to himself. Then one night he just disappeared. What do you mean, disappeared? I asked. Gone, Harris said, like he got up and left in the middle of the night. The hostel staff found his stuff still here, his shoes under the bed. They called his family, the police. No one knows what happened to him. He just vanished. Maybe he ran away, I suggested. Harris shook his head. No one runs away without their shoes. I laughed nervously, but the story stayed with me. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone sitting in that bed, staring at me. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. I turned toward the sixth bed, and there it was. A figure sitting up. This time, I didn't blink. I stared at it, my body frozen in place. It looked human, but its head was tilted unnaturally to one side, and its hands were resting on its lap like it was waiting for something. Then it moved. It turned its head toward me, slowly. I couldn't see its face, just darkness where its eyes and mouth should have been. And then it smiled. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't scream, I could only watch as it slid off the bed and stood up. The figure took one step toward me, then another. The floor didn't creak. Its movements were silent, smooth, like it wasn't really touching the ground. It stopped at the foot of my bed. For what felt like hours, it just stood there staring down at me. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked back to the sixth bed. It climbed in and vanished. When I woke up the next morning, the bed was empty. The sheets were neat, folded perfectly, as if nothing had happened. I packed my things and left the hostel that day. I didn't tell anyone what I saw, not even Harris, but I still think about it. Sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I get the same feeling I had back then, the weight of something watching me. And I remember the sixth bed, waiting for someone else to fill it. It was 3 years ago when I took a road trip with my friends, Bilal, Saad, and Imran. We were all in our early 20s, with nothing to lose and nowhere we had to be. We wanted adventure, to leave the noise of the city behind and drive into nothingness, just because we could. We loaded up Imran's old Corolla with snacks, maps we didn't plan to use, and enough music to drown out any silence. Our plan was simple: drive until we were too tired, crash at the cheapest motel we could find, and do it all again the next day. But things don't always go according to plan. On the second day, we were deep into rural country. I don't remember when the signal on Saad's phone died. The roads were empty, stretching endlessly into the horizon. Fields on either side of us were brown and dead, with nothing but the occasional skeletal tree breaking the landscape. No houses, no gas stations, no signs of life. "We're lost," Imran muttered from the driver's seat. Saad, who'd been squinting at the map for half an hour, threw it down in frustration. "It's a straight road. How the hell are we lost?" Bilal laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe it's a test. Whoever passes through this road becomes a better man. Or disappears forever," I joked. No one laughed. It was around sunset when we first noticed the tree. It stood on the right side of the road, tall and crooked, with bare branches that looked like outstretched arms. I remember Bilal pointing it out. Creepy as hell, he said, grinning. Looks like something out of a horror movie. We kept driving, but the road felt longer somehow. The sun was sinking faster than it should have, and the air inside the car grew heavy. An hour later, we passed the same tree again. I stared at it as we drove by, my stomach twisting into knots. Did we just... Impossible, Sod interrupted. We've been driving straight. There's no way. But there it was. The same crooked tree, standing silently in the dying light. None of us spoke for a while. By nightfall, the road felt endless. The darkness pressed against the car windows like it was alive, swallowing the headlights before they could reach the horizon. Imran's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. This isn't normal. We should have hit a town by now. Bilal leaned forward, peering out the windshield. What if we're driving in circles? Maybe the road is looping back on itself. Saad snorted. That doesn't happen in real life, Bilal. But no one really believed that. The fields outside seemed to close in on us. Shadows moved at the edges of the light. Probably animals, I told myself. But the longer I looked, the more I thought I saw figures. Tall, thin shapes standing motionless among the weeds, watching us. I didn't say anything. We were all tense, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine. Then in the distance, we saw something. A house. It was faint at first, just a pinprick of light flickering far across the field. The closer we got, the clearer it became. A small, one-story house, hidden among the grass. A lantern swung from a post near the front door. We need help, Bilal said, his voice quiet. I don't know, Imran murmured. Something's not right. But Saad was already opening the car door. We don't have a choice, man. We're stuck here. The house was worse up close. The walls were warped, the paint peeling like dead skin. The lantern outside creaked as it swung, its light casting jagged shadows across the front porch. Saad knocked on the door. Hello? Nothing. He turned to us, shrugging. Maybe no one's here. As he said it, the door opened. It didn't swing open all the way, just enough to show the dark hallway beyond. Cold air poured out, making my skin prickle. Let's just leave, Imran whispered, his voice shaking. Saad ignored him and stepped inside. The rest of us followed, though every step felt like a mistake. Inside, the house was silent. The hallway stretched forward, leading to rooms that opened like mouths. There were no lights, no furniture, just dust, dirt, and the faint smell of something rotting. We moved slowly, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Then I saw the pictures. They lined the hallway walls, old, black and white photographs. People stood in rows, staring straight ahead. Their faces were blurred, their eyes smudged dark. And in one of the photos, I swear I saw us. 4 figures, standing beside a car. I stumbled back, grabbing Bilal's arm. We need to leave, now. What's wrong? He asked. Before I could answer, we heard it. Footsteps. Coming from the room at the end of the hall. We froze. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone walking barefoot across the wooden floor. Who's there? Saad called out. No response. The footsteps stopped. Then the door at the end of the hallway creaked open. I didn't want to look, but I did. The door swung back to reveal a figure standing in the center of the room. Its back was to us, but its body was wrong, twisted and thin, like something stretched too far. Slowly it turned. Its face was pale, with empty black eyes and a smile that split its face in half. It stepped forward. We ran. We burst out of the house, tripping over each other in our panic. The lantern outside had gone out and the field was pitch black. The car was gone. We were trapped. The house loomed behind us, silent and dark. I could feel it, something watching us from the windows, waiting. "Where's the road?" Imran shouted, his voice cracking. The road we'd driven on was gone. The field stretched endlessly, disappearing into darkness. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Close this time, coming from behind us. We didn't look back, we just ran. Eventually, the darkness started to fade. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, and we found ourselves back on the road. The car was there, parked exactly where we'd left it. No one spoke as we climbed inside. Imran started the engine, and we drove. We didn't stop until we were hours away. Later, when we checked the maps, that stretch of road didn't exist. There was no house, no fields. But I still see it sometimes. When I drive late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the distance, a faint light flickering just off the road. And I know it's waiting for us to come back. I was 12 years old the first time I saw the figure in the house across the street. We lived in a small neighborhood, the kind where the houses all looked the same. 2 stories, faded paint, tiny front yards. But there was one house that stood out. It sat at the very end of the road, surrounded by weeds that climbed over its cracked walls like they were trying to pull it back into the earth. No one lived there, not for as long as I could remember. My parents said it had been abandoned for years. "Don't go near it," my mother told me whenever I asked about it. "It's dangerous." But I couldn't help it. There was something about that house, something that pulled at me, like it wanted to be seen. It was late one summer night when it all began. I had stayed up far too late watching TV. The house was silent, my parents already asleep. I'd gone into the kitchen to get a glass of water when I happened to glance out the window. And that's when I saw it. The upstairs window of the abandoned house. There was someone standing there. A figure perfectly still, a shadow against the pale moonlight. I froze, the glass in my hand halfway to my lips. My heart started pounding in my ears, drowning out the silence. I stared at the window, trying to make out details, but I couldn't. It was too dark. I waited, expecting it to move, to disappear. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching. I backed away from the window and ran upstairs to my room. I didn't sleep much that night, tossing and turning under the covers, glancing nervously at the curtains every few minutes. By morning, the figure felt like a dream, but I knew what I saw. A few days later, I told Samir, my best friend. He lived just down the street, and when I told him about the figure in the window, he didn't believe me. "It's probably just shadows," he said with a shrug. "The house is empty, remember?" "But I saw someone," I insisted. He rolled his eyes. "Prove it then." So that night, Samir came over. We sat on the floor of my bedroom, facing the window with the lights off. The house across the street loomed in the dark, its upper windows like black holes. We waited. An hour passed and nothing happened. Samir was starting to laugh at me when I suddenly grabbed his arm. "There," I whispered. The figure was back, standing in the upstairs window. Samir's laughter died instantly. We both stared, frozen. "Is it moving?" Samir whispered. I shook my head. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head slightly tilted, like it was listening to us. And then slowly it raised a hand. It was waving. We both scrambled back from the window. Samir was pale, his mouth open like he wanted to scream but couldn't. "Let's go," he said finally. "Let's check it out." I didn't want to go. But there was something about the house. It was like a hook buried in my mind, dragging me toward it. We crossed the street with flashlights, the glow barely cutting through the dark. The yard was even worse up close. Overgrown grass, broken tiles scattered like debris. The front door was locked, so we went around back. A small window near the kitchen was broken. Samir boosted me up, and I climbed through, landing hard on the kitchen floor. The air inside was ice cold, and the smell hit me immediately, stale, like rot and mildew. "Are you okay?" Samir whispered from outside. "Yeah," I said. "Come on." I helped him through, and together we stood there, staring into the darkness. My flashlight swept over old counters and peeling wallpaper. It didn't feel like an abandoned house. It felt occupied. We moved through the rooms, staying close together. The living room was empty except for a few broken chairs and a fireplace choked with ashes. Upstairs was where the figure had been. Neither of us wanted to say it, but we knew where we were going. The staircase creaked under our weight as we climbed. The air grew colder the higher we went. My flashlight flickered, the beam shaking in my hands. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with open doors. Samir pointed toward the far end. "That's the room," he whispered. The door was closed. I didn't remember moving toward it. One second I was standing at the top of the stairs, and the next I was in front of the door, my hand on the knob. Samir was right behind me, his breath shaky and loud in my ear. I turned the handle. The door creaked open. The room was empty. No furniture, no curtains, just a single window on the far wall, the window where we'd seen the figure. I stepped inside, Samir right behind me. The floor groaned under our feet, the sound stretching out like a warning. "It's empty," Samir said quietly. I turned to him to say something, but then I froze. He was looking at the window, and there, reflected in the glass, was the figure, standing right behind us. I spun around, but there was no one there. "What the hell?" Samir started to say, but his voice caught in his throat. The flashlight in his hand dropped to the floor, rolling toward the corner of the room. I grabbed his arm. "Samir, come on!" We ran. We didn't stop running until we were back outside, gasping for air in the overgrown yard. My flashlight was still clutched in my hand, its beam bouncing wildly across the grass. We didn't look back at the house. Neither of us spoke as we crossed the street and climbed through my bedroom window. When we got inside, Samir sank onto the floor. "What did we see?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't know. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept my curtains shut tight, but I couldn't stop imagining that figure standing in the window watching me. Around midnight I heard a sound. A soft knock. It was coming from my window. I froze. My body refused to move. I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop. The knock came again, and then faintly I heard a voice. "Let me in." I didn't open the curtains. I didn't look, but I could feel it. Standing there, waiting. I never saw Samir again after that summer. His family moved away and we lost touch. But sometimes when I drive past that street, I see it, the empty lot where the house used to stand. And when I look closer, I swear I see someone standing there, watching me. I was never supposed to inherit the house. It had belonged to my uncle, a man I barely knew. I'd seen him maybe 3 times in my life, always distant, always strange. But when he died, I was listed as the only heir. There were no explanations, no handwritten letters or final messages, just paperwork, and a set of heavy keys that felt like they weighed more than they should have. The house itself was far from town, tucked behind overgrown fields that had swallowed any sign of a driveway. By the time I got there, the sun was sinking and the place stood in silhouette, sharp and jagged against the dying sky. I remember stopping at the gate. For the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't want to go forward. Like some instinct, something primal was trying to tell me to leave, but I didn't listen. I should have. Inside, the house was freezing. The front door opened into a narrow hallway. It smelled like dust and mildew, like no one had set foot there in years. The furniture was covered with white sheets that billowed slightly as I walked by, even though there wasn't a single breeze. Everything looked exactly as I remembered from when I was a child. The scratched wooden floors, the chipped banister, the grandfather clock in the corner that had never worked, but something felt off. It wasn't until later that I realized what it was. The house was too quiet. That night I decided to stay. It didn't make sense to drive back to town so late, and besides, I'd come prepared with a sleeping bag and supplies. I set up in the living room, right near the fireplace, telling myself the place was just old and creaky, that the strange weight I felt pressing on my chest was just in my head. But when I closed my eyes, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing something, not loud or obvious, just faint, like someone moving upstairs. A soft thud, then nothing. I sat up, listening. The sound was gone. The next morning, I explored the house more carefully. It wasn't large, 2 floors, a handful of rooms. A small attic I remembered being too afraid to climb as a child. Most of the rooms were empty now, except for dust-covered furniture and peeling wallpaper. But then there was the room. At the end of the hallway upstairs, there was a door I didn't recognize. I swear it hadn't been there when I was a kid. I tried to convince myself that I'd forgotten about it, that my memory wasn't perfect. But the door looked new. The wood wasn't warped like the others, and the brass handle was polished, shining faintly in the dim light. I hesitated. My hand froze just above the knob, a cold dread building deep in my stomach. Eventually, I turned it. The room was empty. No furniture, no windows, just walls. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, aside from the fact that the air in there was colder than the rest of the house. But as I stepped inside, my foot hit something hard. I looked down. It was a small wooden box. I picked it up. The lid was scratched, almost like someone had tried to claw it open. My hands trembled as I lifted it. Inside was a single piece of paper, yellowed, brittle. Written on it in jagged handwriting were 3 words. "Don't look up." My breath caught in my throat. I don't know why I did it, why I didn't just run, but I looked up. There was something in the corner of the ceiling. A shape, hunched and unnatural, as if it had been crammed into the narrow space. Its limbs bent at impossible angles. Its head turned slowly toward me, and though the face was shrouded in shadow, I could feel its eyes on me, watching. I dropped the box. My body moved on instinct, sprinting out of the room and slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the key into the lock. I backed away instead, my heart pounding, my ears ringing with the sound of my own breath. For a long time I stood there staring at the door. Nothing happened, no sound, no movement. But I could feel it. It was still there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room staring at the staircase, waiting for something to happen. The house felt wrong, like it was breathing around me, its walls tightening and shifting just outside my vision. Around 3 a.m. I heard it again. A slow, steady thud, footsteps coming from upstairs. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and ran for the front door. The knob wouldn't turn. I yanked it, kicked it, but it was no use. I was trapped. The footsteps grew louder. Then they stopped. Right at the top of the stairs. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. But I did. There it was. Standing at the top of the staircase. It was tall, its body wrapped in shadows that shifted like smoke. Its head tilted as it looked at me. And then it moved. Slowly. One step at a time. I don't remember much after that. I think I blacked out, because the next thing I knew, I was outside, lying in the dirt. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes. The door was open, but I didn't go back. I never went back. The house is still there. Sometimes I dream about it, shouts about the door that shouldn't exist and the thing that waits behind it. And when I wake up, I swear I can hear it. Footsteps. Slow, steady. Coming closer. It was never my plan to end up in that house. The kind of place that whispers your name in the dark. You know the type. It looks normal from the outside. Abandoned, sure, but nothing extraordinary. Yet there's something wrong. Something festering beneath the walls. It all started when I got a call about my uncle's death. Uncle Farid. A strange man, a recluse. They found him slumped in his dusty chair, face frozen in terror as if he'd seen something unseeable.
Jam.
I hadn't seen him in years, but since no one else would step forward, I became the next of kin. The paperwork said I'd inherited his estate, a run-down mansion on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't a fortune, but in a strange way, I felt drawn to it, like something was pulling me.
Jam.
The day I arrived, the sky was gray. Heavy clouds smothered the light. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, a sound that scraped along my spine. I stood there for a long moment staring at the house. 2 stories of rotting wood, broken shutters, and dark, empty windows, like a corpse left to rot, and yet, there it was, waiting for me.
Jam.
The door swung open before I touched it. My breath caught. I stared at the yawning darkness beyond. Hello? My voice sounded weak, useless. Silence. I stepped inside and the temperature dropped like I'd walked into a freezer. My breath misted the air. Dust blanketed the house, the furniture, the walls, the air itself. It settled into my lungs, heavy and foul. A clock ticked somewhere faintly in the house. It was an old, hollow sound, like something from another time. Val. I explored in silence. The house felt alive in the strangest way, too still, too watchful. The study upstairs was the worst. Bookshelves lined the walls, their spines cracked and dusty. A desk sat in the middle of the room, a chair pushed slightly back. It was here I found the journal, hidden under a loose floorboard. It was a leather-bound book, heavy. A smell of mildew clung to its pages, faint but rancid. I opened it. December 10th. I hear scratching at the walls. First I thought it was rats, but it isn't. December 13th. I found footprints this morning, not mine, smaller, bare, dirty. December 17th. The whispering started. I can't understand it, but it's always there, underneath everything. December 20th. It's inside. I let it in. It watches me. I can feel it. December 25th. There is no escape. It won't let me leave. The final entry chilled me to the bone. The handwriting had changed, jagged, wild. It wants a new host.
Jam.
I slammed the journal shut and tossed it onto the desk. My hands shook. The silence in the room grew heavier, thicker. And then I heard it.
Jam.
Scratching.
Jam.
Soft, faint, and deliberate. It came from the wall behind the bookshelves. My breath hitched. Slowly, I turned my head. The sound grew louder, moving along the walls.
Jam.
A low, creaking groan echoed through the room, and I stumbled back. Books tumbled from the shelves as if knocked aside by invisible hands. I spun on my heel and bolted from the study, slamming the door behind me. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long. I blinked. The house had changed. The walls seemed to move, shifting and pulsing as if they were breathing. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but every turn led me back to the same place, the mirror. It sat at the end of the hallway, a towering, ornate thing covered by a sheet. My heart pounded. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't. But my hand lifted, fingers trembling as they grabbed the edge of the sheet. I pulled it off.
Whoa.
The glass wasn't broken, but the reflection was wrong. The hallway behind me stretched endlessly, its walls warped and black, and standing there behind me was her, the woman.
Jam.
Her head hung low, long black hair falling like a curtain over her face. Her arms dangled at her sides, unnaturally long and limp. And when she moved, a twitch, a jerk of her shoulder, I froze. My mind screamed, but my body refused to move. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her face, oh God, her face, was pale and stretched, her mouth twisted into an open grin too wide for her head. Her eyes were black holes, empty and endless. She stared at me, that grin spreading wider, and I heard it. Let me in. My own reflection smiled back at me.
Jam.
I ran. Down the hallway, through rooms that weren't mine, past shadows that moved and walls that whispered. But no matter how far I went, she was always there, in the mirrors, in the corners of my eyes.
Jam.
By morning, I stumbled outside. The sky was gray, the air heavy. I looked back at the house, its windows staring like hollow eyes. I didn't care about the journal, the mirror, or my uncle. I needed to leave. But I couldn't. The car wouldn't start. My phone was dead. The road back to town wasn't there anymore. There was only the house.
Jam.
That night I heard her voice again. This time she was closer. Stay.
Jam.
The mirror is in my room now. I didn't put it there. I can see her behind me, smiling. She's getting closer. I can't leave.
Jam.
If you're reading this, it's too late. She'll find you too.